Peralta. Can you hear me? You can hear me now. Okay. I know you've been doing some sessions on your day job, which is, you know, Professor of Classics, but we're going to talk really about your personal story today and the book that you have written, which is Undocumented, a Dominican boy's odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League. And I think it's so timely now, given the recent declaration about the elimination of the DACA program, to speak to someone who has lived through very, very complex immigration history. And I think it's so important that we hear these stories for people who have the privilege to never have to engage with the immigration service, who never have to even really think about the complexities of all of this. I think it's really powerful to hear stories like that of Danelle. So we're delighted to have you here. You were born in the Dominican Republic, and you and your mom and your, well, yet to be born brother came to the US, and it was due to a medical issue, but you did come on some type of a visa. Take us back to that. How old were you?
That's right. We came on a tourist visa, and the primary motivation for our travel was medical. My mom was experiencing pretty serious pregnancy-related complications, and the thinking was that she would be able to obtain prenatal care of a markedly higher caliber than what was available to her in Santo Domingo in the States and in New York City. Her doctors had pointed her to some practices in New York City where she might obtain that care. And here is where migration is always a multi-layered story. We had a kind of privilege. This privilege consisted of having the resources to put together and file successfully for tourist visas in Santo Domingo at a time when the issuance of visas to Dominicans was beginning to be restricted. And so because my parents were both middle class and because we had the income to pay for a short-term trip to the United States, we made the trip and my mom obtained the medical care that she needed. And then things got really interesting.
Well, you ended up staying on due to a realization that you could really only get the medical care here. But you talk about the privilege that you had back in the Dominican Republic. You gave all of that up, or your family did, when you were here. And one of the big themes of your book is poverty, and how poverty was just such an oppressive factor. And of course, the two things are so closely intertwined, your immigration status and poverty. So ultimately, you ended up in a homeless shelter. What was the trajectory of coming here for some medical care to ending up in a homeless shelter in New York?
Right, so after my younger brother was born successfully, my mom experienced further medical complications that resulted in her having to be hospitalized again at Columbia Presbyterian in New York City. And as she began her recovery, my parents had a series of conversations about whether they should stay in New York City. One of the catalysts for this conversation was their realization that I was really enjoying kindergarten in New York. I'd been enrolled in kindergarten, first in a school in Washington Heights and then in the Bronx. And I was really taken to it. I really, really enjoyed the experience of learning English. I would walk around and imitate English speakers and repeat very faithfully what came out of their mouths, no matter what it was. And my parents saw that I was deriving some joy from this. I really liked the New York City subway. This is something I talk a little bit about in the book. I just loved riding trains. And faced with what they recognized as my sheer joy, my parents began to give serious thought to staying. But here was the documentation problem. So we had come on tourist visas and those visas expired. And my parents were conscious of the need to regularize our status. They knew enough about how the immigration laws to recognize that they had to find some way of securing a medium-term status that would enable them to work legally in the United States. The only problem was that they didn't know how to do this. So they asked around, and eventually they were directed to someone who claimed to be an expert in these things. But this person was not an expert at all. And my parents paid him, and he then disappeared. So that took care of the money that my parents had saved up by that point. And my parents, despite this experience, decided that they would try to stick it out in New York City and find some way of regularizing their status down the road. But what this meant for both my mom and dad was that whenever they took up any offer of employment, and my parents held down a variety of jobs in the several years after our arrival in the States, inevitably they would eventually be asked if they had authorization to work. And well, when that question came, my parents would just move on to the next job, and so on. And this repeated itself. In 1993, so about 3.5 years into our time in the States, my dad announced that he'd had enough of this. He had become really, really frustrated at what he perceived to be the sort of undignified treatment that came with being an unauthorized immigrant. And so he told my mom that he wanted to head back to the Dominican Republic. And my mom at that point said, well, you can head back, but I'm going to stay here with our 2 boys, and we're going to figure something out. And initially, I guess she thought that he was not being all that serious, and I think my dad also misread my mom, because he must have thought that she was not serious. But in any event, he left, and my mom did not follow. She chose to stay in New York. Eventually, my parents divorced, and we were left on our own in New York City. Initially, my mom thought that things would work out okay. She had a part-time babysitting job, and she was looking at a number of employment offers in Queens, where we were living at the time. But we began to fall behind on our rental payments for our apartment in Jackson Heights. And at the beginning of the summer of 1992, we were evicted from our apartment, and after several weeks, we ended up in the shelter system. First in Chinatown, New York, and then in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where we spent pretty much the entirety of my 4th grade year.
So obviously you were aware of the financial status and what was happening with your family, but did you have an awareness of the immigration status when you were a young child? Like, at what point did you realize that we're undocumented?
So awareness of what being undocumented meant didn't arrive at some kind of sort of magical sort of moment of realization. It really came in sort of installments. It was a gradated knowledge. So I did a lot of translating for my mom already as a 7, 8, 9-year-old because she was very insecure about her English. And it was in translating for her in front of public assistance officers that I began to piece together what it meant to be undocumented. So here's one example. We received public assistance support, but that public assistance support, because of a wrinkle in the law that was then really stabilized by a series of reforms in 1996 and after, this public assistance was prorated to cover only my younger brother, who was a U.S. citizen. So neither my mom nor I were eligible. We didn't have permanent residency, so we could have received benefits if we'd had residency. We were out of status, and so my mom could only receive benefits insofar as those benefits were geared towards putting food on the table for my brother, right? So our food stamp allotment, for example, was calibrated to cover my brother only, and the rental assistance we received once we were placed out of the shelter system was calculated to cover only my brother, and then my mom, insofar she was the guardian. So when I had to translate for my mom in public assistance offices and explain to her what public assistance caseworkers were telling us, that we were not eligible for certain things because we were not in proper immigration status, that was one of the first moments where I began to see how our status affected us. And I had already had reason to observe that it clearly impinged on my mom's ability to obtain and maintain secure employment. But where it really did hit home was about 1.5 years after we were placed out of the shelter system. My mom's dad passed away in the Dominican Republic. And I thought that we would travel back to the Dominican Republic for his funeral. My mom was on the phone with her sisters, 3 of whom were still living in the Dominican Republic. And she was crying, upset at the news, and those sisters of hers who were already in the States were making plans to head back to the Dominican Republic. And after my mom got off the phone, I asked her, why it was that we weren't traveling back to the Dominican Republic. At which point she explained to me that if we left the United States, we would not be able to re-enter, right? And so that was when it began to click, really, what it meant to not have papeles. There were other moments that I dwell on in the book, but that was really a turning point in my recognition of what it meant not to have papeles. It meant that our mobility was taken from us. Our possibility of even returning back to our home country was rendered problematic because of the risk it would pose and the likelihood that we would be barred from return.
Even at that age, you were immersing yourself in books. I mean, there's a scene where were you 9 reading a book about Napoleon, and you're reading all of these. I mean, you were just loving the books. Even in the shelter system, you still managed to find, to really prioritize your education. It was a passion of yours. When you realized what it meant to be undocumented, did anything shift in what you had hoped for your future, what you thought education might do for you?
So my mom had a way of sort of lecturing her 2 sons on the importance of education and what education would do for us. And one of the messages she repeatedly imparted was that with education and with reading, we would be able to extricate ourselves from the situation in which we had found ourselves at the time, and we would be able to create a bright future, and that nothing would be impossible. All doors would be open through education. And she really maintained this optimism, even as I became somewhat jaded about this. I threw myself into reading, especially while we were living in the shelter system, because thanks to books, it became possible for me to imagine a space or spaces beyond the shelter. But there were moments, especially as I became older and I became a teenager, where, to quote my brother's own formulation of this, I thought we would never get out of the hood. And that was really demoralizing. My brother had, in many ways, a trajectory similar to mine, as I discussed in the book, but he was even more burdened by the insecurity and anxiety of the experience, the deepening pessimism that came as we were shuttled from within the shelter system to these public housing or public housing voucher subsidized apartments that reinforced for us the message that we would never get out of the hood. And we, in our own different ways, labored under this weight, even after things did begin to look up, even after we were admitted to competitive schools, even after we were admitted to the colleges of our dreams. The specter of anxiety that had really been fed while we were in the shelter system and after, didn't really leave us. And I would say it hasn't really left us. But I mean, that's a conversation possible for the Q&A.
I mean, I often think about that, the mental health implications of living, not just under the anxiety of, or the idea that your dreams are limited, but the fear that many people have of being deported. We're seeing an increase in raids, and some local immigrant rights advocacy groups are concerned about an uptick in raids, even this weekend as we speak in parts of Colorado. Was that part of the fear as well? Were there raids happening in New York? Were people being deported? Was this part of this anxiety we're experiencing?
So now we talk about changes in immigration policy. So one of the major developments in immigration policy that really decisively altered the lives of many in this country, including those who were living in the country without status or without papeles, occurred with the bundle of immigration reforms that were passed in 1996. Those of you who were around in 1996 will know that this occurred under a Democrat president, right? And this Democratic presidency was admirable for many things, and I owe a great debt to the Clintons for reasons we can talk about in the Q&A. But immigration policy in the 90s was not one of the reasons why we should praise the Clintons. So what happened in 96? Among the many reforms that were introduced was a really drastic, some might think draconian penalty applied to people who had been living in the country without status. So if you had been living in the country without status for 180 days or more, if you had overstayed a visa for 180 days or more, you would be subject to what was called the 10-year bar. And what the 10-year bar meant was that if you exited the country, you would not be allowed back in for 10 years. You could apply for a waiver of inadmissibility that might authorize you to re-enter, but it was made clear then, and was made clear over and over again, that these waivers would be extremely difficult to secure. In tandem with the passage of enforcement, with the passage of the bar and its constellation of reforms in '96, came a real amplification in the border enforcement and deportation regime. So when I was a teenager, Univision and other Latino-centered channels began to chronicle deportations. And this scared the shit out of me. It scared the shit out of me when it started happening in New York City. And it really began to take on a menacing complexion. Not that it didn't have one in '96, '97, '98, but it really took on a new and even more sinister complexion in the aftermath of 9/11. So, as many of you will know, in the aftermath of 9/11, the promulgation and implementation of the Patriot Act's various provisions conduced to a comprehensive restructuring of the immigration enforcement system, the creation of DHS, and the centralization of the apparatus for deportation. But here too, there occurred something that was seemingly minor, but that would also have implications for undocumented folk. As I learned much later from a lawyer, there used to be this, this loophole in the immigration statutes. The way this loophole worked was that if you had been living in the country without status, you could apply for a change of status to the Immigration Service. You would out yourself, and you would pay a pretty substantial fine. But then the Immigration Service could exercise discretion and enable you to pursue a change of status. It could simply say, you paid your fine, you've acknowledged yourself to us, now go on ahead, get status. This was phased out after 9/11. So this loophole was closed. It was allowed to sunset, and there would henceforth be no grants of this kind of discretion, except in instances where, for example, you managed to get a bill passed, an individual bill passed through Congress on your behalf. That was it. All of this meant that by the time I was in college, I was worried not only that there would be no pathway to legalization ever, but that my mom or I would be deported at some point because there were raids taking place in New York City. There was a raid that occurred in Princeton when I was an undergrad. There were all these signs that things were not going to look all that great for my future and for the future of my family in the States.
You mentioned 9/11. Now, I'm an immigrant myself, and I came in prior, like in the 90s, and before then it was INS, Immigration Naturalization Service. Now that was its own bureaucratic labyrinth. But after 9/11, as you said, it was the Department of Homeland Security, and that's when immigration seemed turned into a security issue. And to me, that's when the narrative really switched. It's like these people are a threat, not just to our economy, but to our safety. Did you feel that outside of what was happening politically, but just living in New York and Princeton, did you have a sense that you were now being perceived as some type of threat? And were you fearful to disclose your immigration status to people because of that?
I was plenty fearful to disclose my status. I mean, I kept it very close. So I mentioned in the book that until my junior year of high school, no one at my high school knew that I was undocumented. Now, they could have figured this out. Every year I filled out this financial aid paperwork, and in order to have the funding, the very generous financial aid package that enabled me to attend my private school on the Upper West Side renewed. And there was a little box where one had to put one social security number, and guess who left that box blank every year? But no one ever asked, right? But my junior year of high school, so this was the year before 9/11, my classmates and I were in the thick of beginning to think about college admissions, and I had been doing some research on the side, unbeknownst to my classmates, to whom I did not want to confide the details of my situation, that pointed quite clearly in the direction of some unfavorable outcome for me when it came time to apply to colleges. There was no indication that there were colleges that would willingly accept me. There was also, and I was particularly concerned about this, no clear evidence anywhere I looked for a financial school that might offer a financial aid package that would cover the need I had, because my family was broke. There was no way we could foot the bill for any of the schools to which I wanted to apply. So, right before 9/11, a few months before, driven in part by the anxiety I had regarding college applications, I opened up about my status to my college guidance counselor. And my college guidance counselor was one of the most extraordinarily supportive people in my life. He was a cheerleader for me then, has continued to be supportive of me since. And he told me that while he didn't know what we, or the school, my school could do, he would see to it that the school did everything in its power to ensure that I had a fighting chance. And that meant the world to me, and that encouraged me to sort of, at least for the most fleeting of moments, adopt a more optimistic outlook. But the aftermath of 9/11 put me in a pretty sour mood, and not only because there were people in my high school who lost their parents on 9/11. My high school was given several days off, and when we reconvened, my senior class reconvened to just sort of air out how we were feeling about what had just happened. And I could already tell that there was anti-immigrant sentiment among some of my classmates. And that was really one of the more distressing moments in my high school education, because I didn't have the vocabulary to confront them directly about it. I didn't know how to position myself such that they recognized that, you know, I wasn't saying 9/11 was a good thing or something like that, but that I wanted them to think twice before they saw what had happened in 9/11 as some kind of door opening for them to act on their most xenophobic or anti-immigrant tendencies. And I really did not know what to do. And I found it terrifying that in the months and years after 9/11, I would find myself again in conversations with people for whom that moment in New York City's history and US history served as a justification for the weaponization of the surveillance and security state. And for its directing and channeling in the direction of those communities of people of color that mattered so much to me. And so that's really what sort of augmented the fear I already had as an undocumented immigrant by the time I was in college and even in the years after.
I think your family history, your personal history really exemplifies the very complex nature of all of this. The fact that in families you usually have mixed immigration status. There's often one or two or more children who are American-born citizens, other siblings aren't, one parent might be, another parent isn't. And all of this then, you know, everybody, like you said, your brother was American-born, so he was a citizen, but he had a huge sense of anxiety because of what was going on with the rest of the family. Did you know other undocumented immigrants when you were growing up in New York? Granted, you were going to a very prestigious prep school in Manhattan, but you know, where you were living, were there other undocumented immigrants? Did people talk about this or talk about the anxiety?
So people talked about it, but we would have conversations about this, usually in certain settings. So my family was very involved in our local Catholic church, and our local Catholic church in Central Harlem, and then another church where my mom also began to do part-time volunteer work in Spanish Harlem, were by the time I was a senior hubs for immigrant communities. There were some well-established immigrant communities, such as Dominican communities that coming down from Washington Heights had made an appearance in Central Harlem, in Spanish Harlem as well. And then there were Central American immigrants who were coming up as part of a new wave of immigration, and for whom these churches were homes. And in the churches, there was quite a fair bit of anxiety about immigration matters. And there were loads of folk who were undocumented or who were going through the change of status procedure, who were half documented. And what was so remarkable about some of these conversations was that many of them operated with the help of suggestive silences. So it would be very hard, it was very hard, for those even who were close to my family, and even some of my relatives who went through similar travails with the Immigration Service, to give you a sort of itemization of what it meant to sort of be undocumented or to be wrestling with the immigration system. Because some of these experiences, and we've alluded to this in another panel earlier today, some of the experiences that people have with the system are so traumatic that they leave you speechless. I can't really talk about them. And you don't want to talk about them, certainly don't want to relive them. And so you might not, for example, want to tell even those close friends of yours at your local church that one of your cousins got deported. Or that you have a close friend who was involved in an arranged marriage for status, and she and the person she married were both nailed for this, and she lost her permanent residency, he was deported, and then she was deported. I mean, this is not the kind of stuff that people easily volunteered in conversation. So usually enough to get to know people really well before they would be willing to open up, and even then they would be hesitant. What was curious in my case was that, as you mentioned, I went to a high school where there were no undocumented immigrants. It was a very privileged school. Later in college, I learned that one of my classmates who was also Latino, while documented, had seen the predations of the immigration system up close and personal as they affected one of his siblings, who was eventually snared by the Immigration Service. But this was something, again, that we were not, as teenagers, going to share with each other quite easily. At Princeton, when I arrived there as an undergraduate, I did not know anyone who was undocumented. Eventually, I discovered that there were several students who had parents who had been undocumented. This came about my junior year. But I didn't disclose the details of my own status to anyone at Princeton until my senior year, when a profile of my journey as an undocumented student was published in the Wall Street Journal. And then, well, other people started sharing their stories with me, and that was cool.
Well, that was a very brave step to publicly come out in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, what was the inner dialogue you were having about whether or not to do that and to announce your status to the world in such a public format?
Well, the dominant internal dialogue, which then became an external one since I had to have a conversation with the person who was most likely to be affected by my coming out as an undocumented immigrant, was what would happen to my mom if I went public with my status. And I approached her and I told her about this Wall Street Journal reporter who had reached out to me. The reporter had reached out to me because she was good friends with someone who knew about my status and who had been very close to me for a long time. And my mom was fearless. She just said, do this. People need to know these stories. And whatever happens, we're going to be here for each other. So just go ahead with it. And I still had plenty of hesitation because I knew that she was trying to model fearlessness for me, but I mean, that didn't shake or allay or assuage the anxiety I had that USCIS would show up and detain her and then deport her. But she was insistent enough for me to be willing to say yes to the piece. The other consideration I had involved my friends at undergrad who did not know about my status. Now again, as I joked with them many years later, some of them could have begun piecing bits and pieces of my lived experience at Princeton and arrived at some preliminary conclusions about what my immigration status was. I was always going to all these meetings with senior administrators to talk about super secret stuff. And yeah, some of these meetings were about the fact that I was doing well at Princeton and I had received these awards, but that was not the only context in which these meetings, for these meetings to take place. And I initially was really reluctant to share the details of my story with my friends because I wasn't really sure that they could understand. But that in itself was a marker of a sort of two different kinds of anxiety about sharing my story. One was my conviction that they weren't in a position to understand because they had had no exposure to the immigration system. So that was one issue. But the second concern I had was, that I talk about in the book, is that I was really worried that their having to deal with my immigration status would be a burden for them. Now, I had to talk myself through this too, but I was worried that, you know, if and when this article came out, people would be hounding them with questions. How does it feel to have an undocumented friend? You know, and if I had been in their shoes, I'd be like, what the fuck? He's just my friend, you know. But like, I didn't at the time fully recognize that, you know, I had to grant them their own agency to deal with this. Like, I mean, I couldn't control them in this way. And that took me some therapy sessions with my close friends to resolve.
Now, your current immigration status, you and your mom are both permanent residents now. And so,
my mom's a citizen now.
Citizen. You're in the path. But walk us that pathway, given that you said early on they got very bad legal advice, or rather they were conned, somebody who was supposedly, and they lost money. Were there efforts along the way to try and get papers, or, you know, how did you both ultimately get where you are?
Woo! I'm gonna ruin all the suspense in the book. Y'all still gotta buy it.
Giving away the end.
So, I had made it a point to begin soliciting legal advice, starting my senior year of high school and continuing in my early years of college. The advice I received was fairly uniform in its content. There is no path to legalization for you. You could get married, but even then, that's not necessarily going to solve any problems. It might introduce new ones. So that's pretty much it. There was legislation that had been introduced for the first time in 2001, and that addressed directly the predicament of folk like me, the DREAM Act. But the DREAM Act did not make it through Congress. In fact, the times it looked most likely to make it through Congress, it was stymied either by the then Senate Majority Leader, who was the father of one of my Princeton classmates, or in 2006-2007 by a real escalation of anti-immigrant rhetoric by folks like the Minutemen, and in media by people like Lou Dobbs, who played a really instrumental role in disrupting what had been for a period of time a bipartisan consensus about the importance of passing the DREAM Act. So all of this meant that by the time my senior year of college approached, it didn't seem like there was much in the way of an option or options for me. But I was very lucky to have been paired up, thanks to Princeton, with a lawyer at Cornell Law who was recognized by his peers as being one of the leading immigration attorneys in the country. And he came up with this idea that had never been tried before, but he said, well, someone's got to try it. So he wanted to apply for what's called a retroactive change of status. And the argument that we were putting forward in the application that we did eventually file was that I had been in no condition to change my status when I was a kid, because I was a kid and then we were homeless. So, you know, there was no, I didn't have anything in the way of resources or in the way of legal knowledge to file together this application. And we would urge the Immigration Service to exercise its discretion to grant me a retroactive change of status. Put together this application, sent it off, and for the purposes of this application, we argued that I was not intent on seeking permanent residency. I didn't want my change of status to be one to permanent residency. I mean, we knew that the service would never in a million years grant this, whatever. I just wanted student visa status. because I was a senior at Princeton, and this was something the service could do. They could just give me status as a student, right? So what did the service do? They communicated through various channels that they had no intention of ruling on the application, ever. Because if they ruled against it, it would create one type of precedent. And if they ruled for it, it would create another type of precedent. So what they would do was simply wait until I graduated Princeton, at which point my application for a student visa would be rendered moot because I would no longer be a student. And that's exactly what they did. So eventually I left the United States. This gets to the fun bit of the memoir. And I was allowed to re-enter on a work visa and with a grant of this waiver of inadmissibility that enabled me to clear the 10-year bar, all thanks to the support of the then senator from New York and future presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton. And had it not been for her office, had it not been for her, I would most certainly not have been granted a waiver of inadmissibility. So that ultimately set the stage for my applying via another change of status protocol for another student visa, and then down the road, I was the beneficiary of a spousal petition for permanent residency. So that accounts for how I got to residency.
And your mom is a citizen, she got married.
And my mom is a citizen because she got married.
Well, I think your experience really highlights one of the biggest misconceptions, and I've heard this in reaction to the decision to rescind the DACA program, and I've heard it from people who I know are aware of the political situation and the efforts to have immigration reform, and I kept hearing, why don't they just fill in a form? As if it was just laziness on people's part. Fill in the right form or get in line, as if there's some line that you could get in. And I think people really need to understand that when you come in and you either overstay a visa or you come in without a visa, there is no line for you to get in, and there are very, very few legal pathways for you to get permanent status here.
Yeah, this was the subject of an excellent sort of slew of pieces that was masterminded by Rachel Blickhouse, who was then working for Matter and is now a reporter at ProPublica some years ago. So she really wanted to apply critical pressure to the idea that there is a line, or that there is a straight shot to adjustment of status for those who are undocumented. And she just had many different folk who had encounters with the immigration system, who had undergone various forms of change of status, or who had no pathway to status, just write their stories. And they were all published, they were rolled out one at a time as essays describing the many different kinds of arcs through the system that exist in the contemporary United States. And what this series did was to show that the U.S. immigration system, like any sophisticated bureaucracy, works in part through a status and distinction protocol. So it creates all of these different categories for prospective immigrants, for immigrants currently residing in the U.S., for documented and undocumented immigrants. And it then sets up procedures that are so opaque that in many cases you cannot dispense with expert legal guidance. Only problem, expert legal guidance is not cheap. And so this further complicates things, right? It also raises the stakes for mistakes. So if you screw up in filling out one of these forms, if you are even in a position where you can adjust status by filling out a form, the consequences can be quite serious. And that's not even to address the fact that none of this adjustment of status business, again, if you are in the position to be able to adjust status legally, if you have a pathway, a certifiable pathway to status, none of these procedures is free. You have to pay fees to the Immigration Service. USCIS runs on fees. And to give you one example, for the bundled application to adjust status that my wife and I filed, what's called a concurrent filing, we had to pay $2,000, and then we had to pay a biometric fee fee that was assessed somewhat later. But then we had to pay an additional fee because the Immigration Service determined that I had to file all this supplementary paperwork for another waiver of inadmissibility. I mean, so this begins to add up, and this adds up even if you don't have a lawyer. And so the cumulative impact of this in the long term is that even for those immigrants who are lucky enough to have a pathway to status, the costs are pretty significant. And for those immigrants who do not have a pathway to status, the real threat they face is that of being rounded up for detention and deportation without anything in the way of advance notice, right? So these are things to keep in mind.
So the current political situation as it pertains to immigrants, we talked about the rescinding of DACA. Of course, Donald Trump ran on an anti-immigrant campaign, building a wall, categorizing people as rapists who are coming here in hordes. It goes back to that change of narrative and that change of attitude toward immigrants now being a security problem that we saw after 9/11. What are your thoughts on the future of this and the fact that it seems to be impossible to get some type of comprehensive immigration legislation passed? They've been trying it for decades and it's never gone through. I mean, do you have any words of hope that you can offer to undocumented immigrants and students who I know contact you as somebody who's out there, who's shared their story?
These are difficult times in which to be optimistic. So on the one hand, the president has reached across the aisle to broker some kind of deal for DACA recipients. What the precise parameters of this are not yet clear, but it seems that a congressional, a bill that will protect documented and dreamer folk will be coupled with some kind of border security provisions and or funding that will not include funding for the wall. So that in the near term seems to be at least on the table as a possibility. There is, however, though, a bigger problem, and it's one that has divided many activists in the Dreamer community. It has contributed to no small amount of infighting over the past few years. Many of us feel that for immigrants who have proven themselves to be prioritized in this way is an affront and a slap in the face to the many, many undocumented immigrants whose contributions to American life are palpable and lasting, but who do not check off the boxes that DACA folk do check off, right? And there is a deeper ethical question that strikes at the very heart of how we value citizenship and civic belonging in the US. And it is the question of whether we assess people's right to belong here solely according to some utilitarian calculus, what they can do for us, what they have done for us, or whether we see ourselves as the kind of country that welcomes people irrespective of, without any consideration of this utilitarian calculus. And it is this tension in the immigration debate and discourse that I see as among the most intractable and among the most difficult to resolve in the short or medium term. Because what we need is really a revolution in values. We need an ethical revolution that recognizes the right of the foreigner to be here without any advanced thought given to whether that person is going to contribute X amount to the US economy or whatever, right? I mean, this is also why I'm so apprehensive about making arguments on behalf of documented folk and on behalf of folk like me that ground themselves primarily in economic considerations. So as some of my closest allies have done, one could get up and say, well, here are the basic data about the contributions of the documented to the US economy. Here are the data about how much undocumented immigrants pay into the social safety net, or how much they pay in the way of taxes. But all of this is to fall into the utilitarian trap again, right? And so in order to move beyond that, we need to refashion arguments in ways that prioritize the ethical urgency of attending to the rights of immigrants. But in the near term, this is really, really hard to pull off politically. And I'm not gonna say that for those Dreamer activists who have been successful in convincing at least some Republicans to join on to efforts to protect Dreamers, that, well, their efforts are short-sighted. I believe we protect those immigrants that we can protect. But we need to think well beyond those immigrants who meet the boxes that have been put down by USCIS and by this sort of meritocratic or pseudo-meritocratic discourse that adjudicates immigrant belonging according to what they can contribute to the economy.
Well, we're going to open up for questions, and actually before we do, I host discussions around immigration frequently, and one thing I do like to ask people if we have an audience is, has anybody had direct interaction with the immigration services, or do you have either yourself or somebody in your close family, and I mean, close-knit family, somebody who's an immigrant and has had to deal with it? Because I often think if you haven't, it's hard to understand how, complex it is. So hands up, who's either directly themselves dealt with immigration services or knows somebody? I mean, not that many, really. Okay. Well, if anybody has a question, please do raise your hand. We have somebody who's going to pass out some microphone.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your wonderful book. One question that I have in relationship to the idea of utilitarianism, utilitarian ties to people, what the value is of a person. Can you talk about the history of the Social Security number and the way that we use it, and the way that we might change how we use it in order to separate that sort of subtle messaging?
So I mean, this is a history that whose narrative has brought together folks who work on immigration policy with folk who work on the history of the 20th and 21st century bureaucratization of the United States. And one of the things that I find very interesting about the indexing of the Social Security number to status and to authorization to work is how it made it possible for the SSN to become a signifying proxy, right? It was, as I had mentioned earlier, it was in my not having an SSN that would have tipped anyone off who had taken a moment to sort of look through my paperwork, that I was not a documented immigrant, or at the very least had given them strong suspicion to believe that I was not documented. This is a problem that more recently has reared its head in connection with how, say, universities handle undocumented folk. So I'll give a brief anecdote from the book, and then I'll relate it to contemporary uses for Social Security numbers. So when I arrived at Princeton, I did not have a Social Security number. And I was greeted on my first day of course enrollment and registration with a little packet. And at the top of the packet I saw that I had been assigned a number that looked like a Social Security number, except it was a 999 number. And this number was used by the university to track me as a student, right? But it had some unexpected benefits that were explained to me when I registered for classes. I could use that Social Security number, that pseudo Social Security number, I should say, to open a bank account, which I did not have. So the local bank in Princeton, PNC, would take students who had these numbers and open bank accounts with them. Now, the reason they would do this was normally these numbers were given to international students until and when they filed for a Social Security number. I mean, so an international student who had been granted a student visa would enter the United States and would, after arriving at his institution and after having his paperwork checked through by the university, if that student had an F1 that enabled him to make use of the work authorization provision, OPT, that student could file for a Social Security number. And generally, that's how it would work. But in my case, that wasn't how it was going to play out because I did not have a student visa. I had nothing of this kind. Nonetheless, the 999 was, at first it seemed to me, useful as a way of opening doors to things that I would not otherwise have access to. Eventually, of course, and this now gets me to your question, it dawned on me that the use of this number as a stand-in for an SSN, and the use of SSNs more generally, was implicated in this broader history that tied the assignments of the SSN to forms of monitoring and surveillance. And it was this broader history now that I think has been very much on the minds of those who are keen to decouple these strategies of surveillance from the day-to-day experiences of immigrants. Because, let's face it, if, as I mentioned earlier, you don't provide an SSN to someone on the receiving end who's asking for one, whether it's in a work context, or even in a bank-related context, for example, to open an account, that person immediately suspects, thanks now to several decades worth of socialization, that you are undocumented. And so this poses problems, and how we go about addressing this is going to be one of the many challenges of refashioning the quotidian experiences of immigrants. A final note on this. Let's say that you want to file taxes, right, but you don't have an SSN. Many undocumented immigrants file taxes. If you don't have an SSN, you would file for an ITIN, right? And that number would enable you to file your tax paperwork. The problem, of course, is that an ITIN is not an SSN. So you can't use an ITIN for the same purposes that you would use an SSN. You can use it for filing tax paperwork, though, and that is very important in the context of these debates that people are having about whether undocumented immigrants pay taxes. Well, I heard someone say, if they don't have social security numbers, then how can they file taxes? I was like, well, see, there are little dispensations for this too, because the tax state always wants its money, so create a little aperture to enable immigrants to file their paperwork. But these are some of the ways that even something as simple as the assignment of a number interfaces with the lived experiences of undocumented immigrants.
But don't they then use the ITIN number to find out who's undocumented?
They can, although this is tricky because there are people who have ITINs who are authorized to work. See, it gets very complicated very quickly.
So what could, say, the University of Colorado administration do to help DACA students?
So there are a couple of things, but here I have to sort of begin by pointing to institutions that have made resources available to students. So I'm going to start by singling out the Cal system and a whole host of private institutions that have created websites where they list the kinds of things that they do or can do for undocumented and documented students. And I would be happy after this to provide a list of the websites where several institutions have curated resources for the undocumented. But in a nutshell, first of all, I think if you're a private or public institution and you have documented students, you have to give serious thought to how you are going to support documented students who might be rounded up. So what that means is you have to figure out if you have the resources available to pay for their legal fees if they are detained. So that's step one. Step two. This comes down to the structuring of financial aid packages, and so this is going to vary between public and private institutions and between institutions that are able to fully fund grant aid for their students as opposed to those who rely on a combination of grant aid and loan aid and work study. But many documented students rely, or thanks to their financial aid packages, are made to rely on some variety of work study. And they can work because they have a work authorization. Well, all right, their work authorization expires. That is now taken out of the financial aid package, and then what? Institutions that have the resources to do this need to consider how they can supplement financial aid to these students and replace the work study allotments that had previously been incorporated into their financial aid packages. Psychological services. This is big. Arguably, it's even more important than any of the things I just mentioned. It matters to have folk who are trained to address the specific kinds of anxiety that undocumented and documented students are going to face in the next few years. If there is no reform passed along the lines of what has been speculated, this combination of DACA protections enhanced to a DREAM Act that would pair these protections with border security, then people's work authorizations are going to start running out, and soon enough, all of those who had previously held DACA will no longer have the temporary status, the temporary work authorization, and the temporary protection from deportation that had come with DACA. So because they are going to justifiably be worried and stressed out of their minds, you will need to have psychological resources available at institutions that can speak to these students, meet these students where they are, and help them, to the extent that is possible, arrive at some form of psychological equilibrium that will enable them to continue flourishing as students. That said, there are going to be moments where institutions over the next few years will realize that even the best staff at their disposal will be unable to deal with the psychological crises that undocumented and documented students are facing. And to that end, there has to be real communal dialogue about not just what psychological support staff can do, but what teachers need to be doing to extend support and consideration to students who are wrestling with the imminent loss of status and who are wrestling with concerns about what might happen to their families. And there also has to be a very public show of support for these students at institutions. And that means having university leadership lead the way in showcasing support for these students at public events staged on campus, via letters to which university presidents have signed on, defending DACA and the documented, and as visible forces in community, in the local community, beyond the university community. All of these, I think, are on the table as things that the University of Colorado and other institutions should be doing.
We just have a couple of minutes left, so I think just one more question.
Well, okay, I have two, but I guess the one I'll ask is, have you or your mom, now that I think you should be able to, but back to the Dominican Republic, does that interest you? Does that feel like a part of your whole still?
So my mom goes back to the Dominican Republic quite often. And my mom and stepdad have a little house there. They travel back a few times a year. I have not been back to the Dominican Republic for a very simple reason, which is that because of Zika and because my wife and I are currently in the demographic transformation process, I'm barred by our doctor from going. But I hope to go there sometime late next year. I do a fair bit of work on classics in the Dominican Republic, and the role of this work in my own formation as a classicist and in the writing I do both in the memoir format and in other genres is one that I think would be greatly enhanced by being able to spend significant time down there. So that's the hope for late 2018, early 2019.
I hope so.
Have you always felt American?
It's tough. I felt kind of American when I was living abroad in the UK, but this was because I was interpolated as American, right? I mean, I would start speaking to a Brit, and Brit would be like, "Duh, this dude's from America." You know? I mean, whereas, of course, had I adopted some kind of like very thick Spanish accent, maybe they would have arrived at a different conclusion. But I feel like a hyphenated American. I feel like a diasporic American, and I relish that. I would hesitate to don the mantle of American, if only because I believe there's a real value to insisting on the hyphenated American. So Dominican American, Afro-Latino American, Hispanic American, I mean, all these are sort of more compatible with the textures of my life than the just straight unvarnished American.
Well, thank you so much. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.